Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're really happy and excited to welcome you to a reading and discussion with Amir Ahmadi Arian, Isabel Hamad, and Azareen Vliet Oloomi. This event is a collaboration between two different initiatives, Archives of the Disappeared at the University of Cambridge and Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm connected to both initiatives. My name is Hannah Morgenstern, and I'm a lecturer in post-colonial and Middle East literatures at the University of Cambridge. So before we start with our fabulous writers, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the initiatives and the theme of these readings. We're thematically linking two separate readings, this reading and another reading which will happen on February 19th with the writer and intellectual Ilyas Khoury and the writer and intellectual Susan Abulhawa under the series title Literature as Archive. And this thematic is informed by the two initiatives. So Archives of the Disappeared is an interdisciplinary research seminar that studies the archiving of communities, social movements, literatures, and cultures that have been destroyed through political repression and mass violence. We've spent the last 2 years examining the question of documentation, narration, and history making in contexts such as colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, slavery, and political repression of movements and societies. Together, we grapple with questions surrounding how to document and analyze and understand that which has been erased and disappeared, asking questions about how to locate and listen to the traces, ruins, memories, accounts, utterances, and the silences and gaps that are left behind. Literatures of Annihilation looks at the way literatures of the Middle East and its diasporas are constituted and shaped by histories of cultural erasure and linguistic repression, colonial, imperial, and state-sanctioned violence, and it examines how minoritized writers and scholars have innovated literary production in the process of responding to violence, to systemic violence. So we come together to collaborate on these events in order to reflect on how literatures of the Middle East engage with these kinds of questions, and especially the question of literature as an act of archiving, which goes beyond what academics and historians can capture. I think, in my estimation, that each of the writers featured today offer important insights into these areas in really striking and distinct ways, and we will continue that conversation after the reading. I want to thank the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough School of Affairs, and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame, and Newnham College and Crash at Cambridge University for their support and co-sponsorship. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the writers who will read from their books, and then we'll have a discussion. So the first writer I'd like to bring up is Amir Ahmadi Arian, who started his writing career as a journalist in Iran. Amir has published 2 novels, a collection of stories, and a book of nonfiction in Persian. He also translated from English to Persian novels by E.L. Doctorow, Paul Auster, P.D. James, and Cormac McCarthy. Since 2013, he's been writing and publishing exclusively in English. In recent years, his work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, the LRB, and Lithub. Amir holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Queensland, Australia, and an MFA in creative writing from NYU. He currently teaches literature and creative writing at City College, New York. So we're very happy to have you. Amir, take it away.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna just do a little reading to kick things off. So this book, for those of you who haven't read it, is the story of a bus driver who gets involved in a strike, organized by the bus drivers union, and ends up in the Evin prison north of Tehran. And the bulk of the novel is set in that prison, and it's, most of it is divided between the interrogation room where this man meets his interrogator and his solitary confinement in the cell. So there are like a few chapters set in the cell, in the solitary. I decided to read a few pages from one of those chapters. This is on page 107, for those of you who have the book. It's the moment that Yunus, the protagonist, the bus driver I just mentioned, he meets a fly in the cell. So this is the first living creature he sees while he is in solitary. Then I saw a fly. The insect, fresh from the free world, was sitting on a slat in front of the open window, rubbing its feelers together. It seemed to be deciding whether to come inside or turn around and fly back out. Its body made a dot on the narrow strip of light between the window slats. The position of its black shadow created the illusion that the edges of the slats bent in toward themselves and made the fly look bigger than it really was. It eventually made up its mind and launched itself into the cell. It maneuvered around briefly, took note of the walls and the ceiling, and alighted back on the slat. "Please stay a little longer." The words left my mouth before I had even thought of uttering them. The fly stopped rubbing its legs, like it was weighing my offer. Then it tiptoed to the side of the slat and stood in profile to me. I came to my knees and followed its moves closely. The fly flew into the room again. It floated straight toward me, circled above my head, drifted away, spiraled down, looped back around, and hovered near my face. I closed my eyes and listened with pleasure to its delicate, air-stroking buzz. Then the fly approached the window, but pulled back quickly. It made another turn around the cell and paused over the toilet bowl, carved out short circles in the air, lowered altitude as meticulously as a helicopter carrying wounded soldiers, and landed on the vomit smear. It jabbed its proboscis into the dry vomit and began to feast. When it had eaten its fill, the fly tore its body off the toilet and took another pass around the cell. It approached the slats 3 times, pulled away at the last second, and returned to hover over my head. It then sped up and zigzagged, swooped down, and landed on my arm. Goosebumps rose up on my skin under its feet. It tiptoed around up to my elbow and back to the middle of my arm and paused there. I watched it with admiration. It seemed like a perfect machine. Even the coloring was beautiful, with its gradual change from black to gray. Its body was tiny and frail, and about a quarter of it supported the disproportionately large compound eyes that captured the world in 1,000 simultaneous discrete images. Its feelers settled on my skin and robbed one another at a carefully calculated frequency, gathering data, or perhaps just enjoying the company of the only other living creature in the cell. "How do you fly?" I asked the insect. "You feed on shit and vomit, but you can go wherever you want. How?" The legs of the fly stopped moving along my arm. It must have sensed a threat. "How? How the fuck is that fair?" The fly took off and flitted around anxiously near the ceiling. "Look, I'm sorry," I said to the insect. My voice grew shrill. "I didn't mean it. I just want to get out of here." The fly ignored me and continued tracing warp circles in the air. Then it accelerated suddenly, yanked around, and started flying into the walls. It was suddenly desperate to escape, but couldn't find the way out. It lurched right before correcting its trajectory towards the mesh of window screen. In a second, it will find it. I jumped up and moved as fast as I could to block the egress. The fly collided with my chest and dove back into the cell, then flew around hysterically. The sudden jump had hurt my knee. I needed to sit and stretch my legs, but I couldn't take the risk. I glared at the fly, offended by its escape attempt. It had fed off my vomit and walked up and down my arm. I could have killed it, and the fly knew it well because it lived in the world of human beings, but I hadn't. It now wanted to go just because I had asked it the question. The fly continued on its quest. It checked every inch of the cell for another crack or hole that could offer freedom. The more it tried to escape, the more agitated I got. When the insect had determined there was no other passage to the outside world, it settled on the wall. Listen, I said, I meant no harm. I just want you to stay a little while and keep me company. It's very lonely here. The fly took off again, spiraling and plunging, making abrupt turns and jags. The pain intensified in my knee. It radiated out from my kneecap, spread and circled around the joint. My body implored me to sit and stretch my legs, but I couldn't give the fly a chance to escape. It landed back on the wall, its rear to the ceiling, its head at an angle that enabled it to monitor all my moves. I noticed an unsettling tilt to its body, an adjustment that I took to mean it had dedicated the full capacity of its compound eye machinery to discovering a way to break free. I imagined how I looked to the insect, blurred and twisted, refracted into thousands of tiny replicas of myself, all trapped in the cell. My knee hurt worse. I couldn't stand much longer. Since I had decided not to let the fly go, I had to either kill or catch it. Killing it would have defeated the purpose, and catching it would be hard. But I had trapped flies as a child. I would bend my palm into a scoop and hold it parallel to the wall near the body of the insect. The fly would take off when my hand got too close, and then I would pounce on it, keep it in my fist, letting it buzz and struggle to get out. When it stopped, I would put it on the floor. The flies never died, but their wings would usually be damaged beyond repair. The insects would be my pets for about a few hours before they succumbed to their wounds. I had to take 2 steps to the wall where the fly was perched. If I took the first one quietly without scaring it, I would be close enough to attack. I rehearsed the operation in my mind, then slowly set down 1 foot. The fly rubbed its legs, seemingly unaware of my intentions. Then my other foot sprang forward. My right hand cleaved the air above the insect, but didn't reach it. A fraction of a second before I got to it, pain struck. I froze mid-step. My leg gave way. My body thudded to the floor. From there, I watched the fly take off from the wall. It moved erratically through the space over my fallen body. When it had confirmed that I was no longer dangerous, its motion became nonchalant. It floated around, circled the cell, and lingered triumphantly over me. Then it flew through the window slats to its freedom. I lay there on my back, looking around at the walls, longing in vain for a movement, a sound, anything that would make me feel that I had not been abandoned. From the floor, I cursed and insulted the creature, threatening to kill it next time it showed up. Then I lay motionless, listening to a silence so thunderous it sounded like a waterfall in my ears, finding the magnitude of my loneliness unbearable. Soon I found myself consumed by a memory, the events of one childhood evening I hadn't thought of in decades. All right, thank you. I leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. That was
Sure.
wonderful. Next we have Isabella Hammad. Isabella Hammad was born in London and lives between London and New York. Her first novel, The Parisian, won a 2019 Palestine Book Award and will be translated into 15 languages. She was awarded the 2020 Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Betty Trask Award, and the 2018 Plimpton Prize for Fiction. And she was a 2019 National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. Welcome, Isabella.
Thank you very much for having me. I've had a little bit of internet issues, so hopefully it won't cut out again. Yeah, I'm right next to the router, so shouldn't do. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be reading with you lovely authors. I'm going to read a bit from towards the end of my novel, The Parisian. It's focused on a character called Jamil, who's the cousin of the protagonist and is politically active in Nablus in the 1930s against the British mandate. And at this point, Midhat, the main character, has suffered a kind of nervous breakdown after uncovering a historic betrayal by his father. And he's in a hospital, and Jamil comes home, and his mother and great aunt want his help to get him out. "You shouldn't have put him there in the first place," said Jamil. "That's what I said," said his mother. "We could have got a sheikh. We could have tried another way. It's the mixture of things, I heard. It's the mixture that makes you mad." She made a fist and swerved her extended thumb from side to side. "Love plus sorrow, love plus grief, grief plus fright. It's mathematical. One man can take only so much. This fire at the shop came at a bad time. Grief plus..." "We're not getting a sheikh." Tahir looked irritated. "He's not possessed." Jamil nearly smiled. Tahir had always been the superstitious one in the family, but his mother appeared to have overtaken her. Perhaps it was a stage women passed through in their journey towards obsolescence, a phase of murmuring born of panic, grappling at trinkets and ancient tricks, from which they finally emerged white-haired, rational and resigned. "I know, Jamil," said Tahir, "that this is not the time for this. You have other things to think about. But think, he's your cousin, he's your brother, and he is suffering in there." Her mouth melted open. She cupped her hand to her face and swallowed her next words. "Listen," said Jamil heavily, though he did not know what he was going to say. "We will take him out," said his mother, "and when he is well, he will become a fighter." "Mama, Midhat will never be a fighter." The telephone was ringing. "Give me a moment." "Basil Murad for Jamil Kamal," said the operator. "Jamil is with you." "Ah, Habibi," said Basil. "We need to go. The road between Anabta and Noor Shams. Are you ready? Abdurrahim al-Hajj Muhammad is leading. Munir has gone to collect the rifles." Jamil glanced over at his mother and great aunt who were watching him. "Do you have that thing we were talking about?" "Yes. The English called for help. That's where the patrols were going." "Anabta exactly?" "Just before." "I'll see you at your brother's." He replaced the telephone. "You're not going," said his mother. "Going where?" "Battle. You are not going." "Mama, relax." "He wants to fight, let him fight," said Tahir. "He's my son." "Look, what time is it now? 11 o'clock. I'll be back for dinner, I promise." His mother released a moan and kneaded the knuckles of one hand into the other palm. "God keep you safe. God keep you. God keep you." Jamil pulled on his jacket and left the house. In general, he avoided thinking about Midhat as much as possible. The day he found his cousin trembling on the floor of Wasfi's study, he had wept briefly in front of Hani. But he did not visit Midhat in the Nablus hospital where he was all winter, nor in the Bethlehem one where he was moved last month, nor had he made plans to. Over the past decade, their contact had been minimal. News of his cousin was mostly mediated by Jamil and Tahir, and by Adel Jawhari and other activists who knew him, and sometimes by those in town who did not know Midhat well, but imitated his gestures and referred to him as the Parisian, with an affection that slid into derision. "I'm going to the banque," was something still said among Jamil's colleagues, with a flipping of the non-firing hand. But Jamil always had the impression, even from afar, that Midhat exaggerated this image for the fun of it. So he was not exactly the dupe of these jokes, but rather, with one further remove, might be extracted from the Parisian entirely, which was not him precisely, but some other person whom he took the liberty to play. Still, as the years passed, Jamil felt shame and irritation when his cousin's name was mentioned. Respectful affection in Nablus had shaded into malice once the Syrians rose up against the French mandate. Everyone knew France was a cancer of imperial force, leeching life from Arab households. To be a Parisian in Nablus was to be out of step with the times, locked in an old colonial formula where subjects imitated masters, as if in the seams of their old garments they hoped to find some dust of power left trapped. This was not precisely the case with Midhat, who seemed rather blind to the deep meaning of his costumes, and was certainly not striving for power or superiority when he meticulously crimped a mouchoir in his pocket and said, "Voulez-vous?" Blinking when they talked of politics, agreeing mildly and continuing on his way, so literally in love with the pattern on a scarf that he would spend great fortunes behind his wife's back in order to import it from Europe. When Midhat had first returned from Paris after the war, Jamil remembered him full of quick energy, with a varnished way of formulating his ideas. France had turned him into a man quite different from the shy schoolboy of their childhood. Many in Nablus even speculated that Midhat might go into politics, given how naturally he discussed Faisal and the Syrian question. Midhat, a politician. Within a year of his return, he became so self-absorbed that he jumped when you spoke to him, and between the pair of them a constriction commenced that neither tried to ease. For a while, Jamil went on craving the lost affinity of their youth, until it was clear that this quality of sympathy would be impossible to revive. Divided from his cousin in the crowd, Jamil's resentment decayed into scorn. In the full sunlight, he began to sweat. In a way, it made sense that Midhat was now in a hospital for mad people while Nablus was in revolt. How else would Al-Barisi have coped with wearing patched trousers? Where would be that man's fortitude, confronted with the scrawny limbs of his nieces and nephews, the hunger and tiredness in the eyes of everyone? Anger was making him walk too fast. He cooled his final thought. Not everyone could be a fighter. When Midhat returned from hospital, he would probably manage as well as most. Jamil turned the corner to Munir Murad's house and in his mind saw Midhat on the floor, holding a letter. He saw his cousin's devastated stare. He felt the return of that ancient fundamental love that had shoved up inside him and turned his own eyes wet with surprise. Munir opened the door. "Ta'al," called Basil from another room. On the dining table lay a flaccid canvas bag with leather straps and a small wooden box lashed to 2 cylinders with copper wire. "I didn't pack it yet," said Basil. Jamil raised the bomb with both his hands. An expert from Damascus had helped them assemble it in the cinema last week, with supplies smuggled in on the back of a vegetable cart. Basil held up the flap of the bag and Jamil slid the box inside and levered the bag onto his back. Though it would not explode until the fuse was lit, at the weight his stomach lifted with apprehension. Basil passed over a rifle and a cloth bag of ammunition. "You collected these in daylight?" Jamil checked the chamber and slipped in 3 bullets. "They've all gone to the mountains," said Basil. "Honestly, if we weren't needed, I'd say we should take the sports club." "Munir, are you coming?" "Next time, boys, next time." They reached Zawata in half an hour. On the parched street, 4 fighters ran to Keach up, wishing them peace. 2 were young and beardless. 1 slim older man carried only a stick. After the greetings, no one spoke. The pale rumble of machine guns echoed from the distance, where a grey balloon of smoke was rising. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, next we have Azareen van der Vliet Oloomi, who is the author of Call Me Zebra, winner of the 2019 PEN/Faulkner Award, the John Gardner Fiction Award, and longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. Azareen is a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree and a Whiting Writers Award winner. Her upcoming novel, Savage Tongues, will be coming out in 2021. She's the director of the MFA Creative Writing Program at Notre Dame and a fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Welcome, Azareen. Take it away.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you especially to our collaborators at Cambridge for just putting this series together so thoughtfully for today and for February. I'm really excited to be here with you guys and to be reading with Isabella and Amir. So as Hannah mentioned, I'm just going to read briefly from my upcoming novel, Savage Tongues, which will be out this summer in August. And I'm reading from the 4th chapter. So all you need to know to be situated is that the narrator is returning to Marbella in Spain after about 20 years. And she's traveling there with her best friend, who's an Israeli-American scholar who's devoted to the Palestinian cause. And the main reason for the journey is to kind of confront a summer that the narrator had spent in Marbella when she was 17 and engaged in an affair with a much older man. And the politics of the Middle East are deeply the novel's deeply informed by the politics of the Middle East, Lebanon and Iran and Palestine in particular. So the narrator and her best friend Ellie are just about to cross the street to the apartment where the narrator had lived as a teenager. It was still early in the season. After lying empty and exposed to the tides of winter, the streets were renewed by the arrival of foreign tourists, Arab sheikhs, Spaniards who kept summer apartments by the sea. The local shopkeepers had stocked and decorated their shelves, thrown windows open to let in the warm air, which trembled with the prospect of money. The early summer light was brilliant, luminous, incandescent. The palms and aloes with their green arching leaves thick with water, the white stucco walls of the homes set squarely against one another, the thick papery bougainvillea that crawled across the city's surfaces like mouths painted rouge, little kisses turned toward the vivid blue of the sky. All of it screamed yes to life. We made our way through the crowd. We maneuvered our suitcases around elderly women dressed in modest pale peaches and purples and sequined flat shoes, around children playfully walking their dogs. Parents trailed languorously behind, occasionally yelling words of caution at their children who were full of zest for the lazy pleasures of summer. We walked alongside the old straw-colored walls of the city, puckered with cavernous holes that resisted the bright, eager light. We stopped a few times, breathless, and set down our suitcases to listen to the cawing of the crows, the whining of the seagulls. Eventually, all that remained of our journey was to cross the promenade that ran parallel to the old Arab walls, walk across the cut granite pavement, the pink and gray stone shimmering in the gleam of the sun. I felt heavy. Across the way, the light seemed to have been sucked from the sky. Darkness abided over our building. It sat on a narrow, crooked street in cold shade. As I took in its smog-stained walls, its blistering paint and cracked terraces artlessly stacked on top of one another, I felt a dreadful stirring. An acidic terror stung my throat. It was a feeling that had stirred in me then, too, during that most terrible summer of my life, its darkest dawn, when the hours had passed under the Spanish sky with no one watching over me. On we went. We walked up the steep, curved road, flanked on either side by cars parked nose to tail, their wheels pulled up on the sidewalk to leave room for passing traffic. All at once, we made our way through the heavy doors of the building into its cool, dim interior. The light in the lobby was wounded, bleak. There was a deadly silence. It was mid-afternoon. The neighbors were likely napping or sprawled out on the sand at the beach. The only footfalls were ours, and yet I felt certain that I was being followed, tracked at a distance. I kept turning to look behind us. When I pressed the elevator button, I felt Omar's hand reaching through mine, as if our bodies were superimposed. For a moment, my limbs filled with lead. All of the energy and vitality and strength I'd cultivated over the years drained out of me. I felt the pressure of his finger against the illuminated call button, and a cold shiver rushed down my spine. I could hear Ellie breathing behind me. I wasn't alone, I reminded myself. No, not this time. I stubbornly held up my head in the face of rising horror. I thought, I've come this far. I'm not going to turn around now, to reverse my steps as I should have done then. The elevator arrived with a disconcerting thump, and its old doors jerked open. The structure was rusty. The hinges squeaked as we rose through the floors, an uncertain hollow sound, an eerie drone that unleashed a feeling of vertigo within me. I closed my eyes. Everything is okay, Ellie reassured. I'm here with you. I heard her words echo against the metal walls of that narrow vault. The elevator halted and bounced on the traction cords before the doors lunged open. We pushed our way through and stood quietly on the landing, our belongings in tow. Which one is it? Ellie asked as her eyes glided down the hall. This one, I said. Door H. I moved closer to its wooden frame and examined the golden H that had been drilled into the wood. When I'd come here before, when I'd first seen that letter, which appeared to me now like two eyes joined together by a knife or a dagger, I'd lost my way in the world. Returning to it now, I was fearful. It's just a door, I told myself, a door like any other, made of wood adorned with a knocker. It had a peephole installed at eye level. I remembered looking through it and seeing Omar for the first time. The concave glass distended his face and curved the corridor. I should have known what he was capable of there, and then I should have sensed the brutality simmering in the depths of his soul from the expression on his face, distorted as it appeared through the peephole, from the way he'd moaned when he let go of the envelope with my allowance, meager as it was. Ellie stood beside me. We're in this together, she said. It was her second attempt at ushering me in. I could hear the consolation in her voice. I took the key out of my pocket, inserted it in the lock, and turned. The door swung open with a strange force, as if its hinges were loose. Or maybe it had a will of its own, had been wanting to open for a long time, to welcome my body back into its hideous entrails so it could feed on fresh blood again. An odious air of mold and sewage and dirt rushed out at us. I promise no one died here, I said to Ellie, forcing a smile. Death comes in many forms, she said. What you went through, it was a kind of death. I said that I suppose she was right, that I died a death in the apartment. I couldn't bring myself to move. My feet were firmly planted in the foyer. The longer I stood there, the more convinced I became that no time had passed since I'd arrived at this point, or that time had passed. It had acquired new dimensions. I'd lived new experiences, but everything that had happened between Omar and me was still in the process of becoming, as though that summer had never found its due place in the grand flow of my life. The events of that summer of lust and trepidation in the Costa del Sol, were continuous. They were stubbornly rupturing the sallow crust of time to call me back to this apartment where I'd been ravished by Omar, strategically consumed. This same apartment with its low ceiling and stained walls, the faint smell of sewage that rose from the floors every time I flushed the toilet. I could hardly believe that I was there. The apartment had been waiting for 2 decades, neglected and yet more or less intact. As I stood in the entryway, I realized that the apartment was a map of my wound. The apartment, I thought, looking around in disbelief, with its emptiness, its dirt, its false appearance as a home. This apartment where I'd arranged my body, exposed it to Omar's terrible desire to drink from my mouth, to stroke my limbs. My eye caught the answering machine, a white plastic box covered with grime and dust. Its surface I could see even from across the room, sticky from disuse. I remembered unplugging it because I was sick of its little red light flashing every day. I was avoiding my mother, even though she was all alone in the world. She'd left message after message for me, the despair in her voice rising to panic, pleading for me to call her, to pick up, to stop torturing her. The memory of those words, the knowledge that I'd hardened in Omar's company, acted cruelly toward myself and my mother, the woman who'd made me, was a stab to my heart. I was disgusted with myself. I watched Ellie forge ahead through the silent hallways and rooms and considered how incapable I'd been, how incapable I remained of fully grasping my adolescent impulses. For years, I hadn't talked to anyone about what had happened. I could barely admit the facts to myself. They settled in the bottom of my mind like sediment, and I did my utmost not to disturb them. But the air of my life was murky, full of dirt and dust and fog. For years, I deceived myself with a story I could live with, instead of acknowledging that Omar had taken advantage of my naivete and innocence. I wove together a hard-edged story that celebrated my perversions and recklessness. Perhaps, I considered, both stories were true. Perhaps my aberrations existed alongside my vulnerabilities. Perhaps they appeared as dichotomous traits when in reality they informed one another. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to take questions, but I want to start with my own question. And in the meantime, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that, you just click on participants. One thing that occurs to me about all of your books, which I read in the past 6 months, sort of one after the other, is that they reflect this like really incredible wave of Anglophone literature that's just kind of now breaking, which didn't even feel possible, at least for me, even 15, 20 years ago. So Anglophone literature coming out of the Middle East and North Africa, whatever was available, what was available even 10, 15 years ago, I think was often translated material that was very much kind of like translated for the West, and was somewhat exotic, and it was hard to find work other than on very small presses that went beyond that. That's just to say that what I wanted to ask you was around this question of writing in English, and also writing to communities. So a question of like where your novel, towards what communities do you feel like your works are facing, and how it feels to write in English, and how that interacts with the other languages you're thinking or dreaming or being haunted in, and the relationships between the different spaces that the novels take place in, and that you're in as a writer. Yeah, that's kind of my question to each one of you.
Yeah, I guess I would agree that sort of with the premise of your question, that these are novels that I think you're absolutely right. I would also conceive of them as this kind of Anglophone, writing that isn't a kind of tourism, literature that we'd seen in the 90s or early 2000s, which I always found very disturbing, because it always reaffirmed the Western gaze, and kind of more deeply entrenched, for lack of a better word, it's very broad and generic, but like Middle Eastern bodies and consciousnesses, into this very stale perspective that's reductive, that often the West, in particular the colonial West has of the region. I think for me in particular, regarding the ways that the novel explores these different like linguistic ghosts, whether it's Farsi or Arabic or Spanish in my case, is just, that's where I am always speaking from. I'm always speaking from the intersection between those languages. And this novel in particular takes place in Andalusia, which is southern Spain, which is itself haunted by a Muslim and a Sephardic past. And as a space, it really challenges the view that Christian and Islamic realities are, exist in a kind of antagonistic relationship with one another, or that they're opposites, or that the East and the West are opposite, precisely because that landscape is deeply informed by Muslim and Christian and Jewish realities that coexisted and took turns sort of being in power. So I think I'm always trying to write from that complicated sort of multi-consciousness space. And that has been a difficult literature to kind of, it's taken a long time for the American landscape to be open to that kind of work that's thinking both within but across nationalisms. That's kind of a transnational novel. And I can circle back to this later. I'm sure it'll keep coming up, but I'll pass it over. If we're reversing, then it's over to you, Isabella.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, given that in America, isn't something like 2% of all books published are translated, that the decks are stacked against translated literature. So if you're writing in English, then you've got a better chance of getting a bigger readership. That's a really wonderful thing in terms of getting other kinds of stories out. As you say, there's an appetite for, I think, literature from the Middle East that is primarily of anthropological or political interest in a sort of simplifying way that speaks to preconceptions. But I think there's still an overhang of that when you're writing in English. I think you're always aware of the stereotypes that abound in the minds of the potential audience, like the States, or even in Europe, but I think maybe especially in America. So there's a feeling, I definitely felt this in writing this novel, that I wrote it certainly not directed at a Western audience by any means. If anything, I was writing it for, I like elderly Palestinians, I think, was my main audience. But there was a feeling of danger. You have to be very careful not to fall into traps, or that anything can be taken as an example or extrapolated from. And I think that is something you maybe feel more if you're writing in English. I wouldn't know, it's the only language I've written in, but I think that is in your mind. You're working in a system that's set up in a particular way when you're writing in this language.
Mm. In the particular case of Iran, I think maybe it's even slightly different from other countries, since the 1979 revolution happened there, and after that, the road was basically one way. So a lot of people left the country right after the revolution or shortly after the revolution and never went back, right? They never traveled back. Out of millions of people who moved out of Iran and formed the Iranian diaspora abroad, very, very tiny percentage of them actually traveled back and forth. So that I noticed, the effect of that one-way road on literature being kind of produced and published about Iran later on. When I was reading the books that are written, by a lot of like British, Iranian American authors, I couldn't recognize the country there, or that they were kind of writing about, like a place that, was kind of gleaned from the memory of their parents, or childhood memories, what they remembered before leaving the country. And because, unfortunately, they never had the opportunity to travel back there, they didn't have like a first-hand experience of Iran in like the 90s or 2000s. So then I, noticed that there's this huge gap between the country that I knew as a person who grew up there and kind of lived there, and the country that I was, reading, kind of being represented on the other side in the West. So this is where I try to sort of situate myself or my literary career, right? Just, very simply writing about Iran over the last 20, 30 years, right? The time period where it's not addressed that much in the West, or it's addressed in a way that is kind of barely recognizable for people who actually live there. So in that regard, I don't think that I ever kind of considered an audience, a specific audience for my book, or I thought that, because I'm writing in English, therefore people of this or that country from this or that background would read it. I try to write it in a way that I, would have written the same story if I wrote it in Farsi. I try to stay as close as possible to the story I wanted to tell, kind of regardless of who will read it, the target audience. Now, I understand it's very idealistic, right? And it doesn't really happen in real life. And as soon as you kind of switch to different language, you move into a different context, and like all those things come with it. Yeah, but when I think about audience, to be honest, the kind of the figures that come to my mind are more like dead writers more than kind of living readers. It's I kind of see a book in like as a part of a journey, or it's in response to what I have read as a reader myself, right? So yeah, there are two things that I had in mind, while kind of working on this book. One of them was this attempt at telling the story of recent Iran from the point of view of someone who grew up there. And the other one is more like a personal thing, to hold the dialogue with the authors that I read and loved and influenced me.
Thank you all. Those are really interesting answers. We have a question from Hana Hassani.
So thank you all for your wonderful readings. I had a question. One of the things that seemed to sort of link the three excerpts was a sense of personal, either, I don't know, responsibility or guilt felt by each of the characters. And I was wondering if this was something sort of intentional as you're writing it. I mean, in the case of In Andalusia, it's sort of trying to reckon with the past, being a sort of almost, I don't know, a paralysis of it in a room. In the case of in the prison, it's kind of confusion and maybe guilt at, doing an action that you may not recognize the consequences of. I mean, I haven't had the privilege of reading all your books, so this is just my little interpretation. But I was just wondering how you feel the interplay of the personal and the wider societies in which your characters are living in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Isabella, did you want to go ahead?
I said, who wants to go first? But you do, so that's great.
I'll be quick. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think there are definitely things that link the three books. There is definitely like a feeling of paralysis in the novel. And I think that excerpt is a kind of paralysis of a thinking pattern, or sort of like somebody trying to come to terms with a past, and to try to understand the present through the lens of the past, and the past being so complex and all of being sort of polyphonic, like all of these different voices informing the landscapes and the histories of those peoples coexist along with the really personal life stories, or the personal destiny, for lack of a better word, of each individual character. And for me, personhood and politics are pretty inseparable, just because of my own life trajectory, and also because of the way that I think about literature and the role of literature in society. And I really am invested in literature that has a deep engagement with history. In the case of the narrator in particular, she's really thinking about erotic desire within the landscape of colonialism and imperialism, particularly from the West to the East, and how desire gets trafficked in that context, how bodies and female bodies are made to be erotic, or what informs female desire, and how it's not separate from the logic of imperialism. So that's kind of a core question about like violence and pain and pleasure and captivity that run through the novel. So I don't know, I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, in my novel, questions of guilt and commitment are quite kind of vital. The book is based on the life of my great-grandfather, pretty loosely based, but he was known as the Parisian in Nablus, and he caught my imagination as a young person because of the way in which he didn't seem to be particularly committed to the political cause, which was interesting to me. And his daughter, my grandmother, was very involved. And I was curious about this character who was sort of obsessed with France and obsessed with a French woman in this particular period. And I was kind of interested in that psychologically. So in some ways, the novel was a sort of psychological portrait of this person who's insufficiently committed, but I didn't want to. I mean, the passage I read is quite a little judgmental from the character of his cousin. I kind of wanted to look at him from all angles. So at once you can kind of condemn him for being very, very self-involved and oversensitive and fragile and sort of concerned with the sort of small sphere of his private life, and his sort of wrong-headed enamorment of a certain kind of Western individualism, which is highly simplified and tied in his mind with French academia. And then on the other hand, I wanted to kind of explore that with full sympathy as well. So certainly the feelings of guilt are there, and the kind of that those themes are very current. But he's not a hero. He's kind of not. He's sort of the opposite of being a political hero in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. So in my case, in this book, I mean, it's all about basically the relationship between an individual and the state, right? So yeah, the individual in the context of a political ordeal. The story is about that. But to just bring up one point about this whole process, what I learned in the process of researching solitary confinement, because I've never been there, thankfully, but I have, unfortunately, a lot of friends who have been there, fortunately for this book, unfortunately in real life. And what I learned is that, how misleading the term solitary confinement actually is. Because when you put someone in solitary cell, what you do is that denying them their solitude. Actually, putting a person in a solitary confinement is bringing them to the closest. It's not even close. Literally, the state is on your body, right? So you basically, put the person in a room where the state is so overwhelmingly present that you're completely paralyzed as an inmate in that environment. So that was a kind of a kind of complicated aspect of that experience, which I wanted to explore in this book. How by being alone in a solitary cell in a prison, you are in the proximity of the state all the time, like 24/7, right? So that was probably the main what I learned kind of the most when I was researching this book. Yeah, then there are lots of things about in the interrogation room as well, right? So you've got one person, the prisoner, interacting with the interrogator. So that interrogator, you know, is there kind of meant to embody the state, like the interrogator, you know, represents like a whole kind of bureaucratic machine behind him. That interaction is there too. Yeah. So it's very much kind of part of this book. Actually, the core idea of this book is what you just pointed out.
Thank you. Thank you for exploring some of those complexities.
Thanks. So we have a few questions about language. I'm just going to call up Mary Best.
So I was just curious, reading books and just, you know, hearing stories and everything from people who are either fluent in multiple languages or had, you know, kind of a non-native English, I guess in this context as an example of it. I was just curious if it does influence the construction of your prose, like if you find it when you're in the process of creating, if whether you're thinking in a different language or just how all those like parts of it, if that influences your prose in any way, and if so, how it does, because those types of things are fascinating to me. So.
Okay, I go first. It's like a, you know, Western kind of showdown, like before the moment all the pistols are pulled. For me, it was you know, I thought the way I kind of articulated them for myself is that there was a big overlap when I started writing in English between Farsi and English, my native tongue. So it's about 10 years ago. Before that, I kind of learned English early in my life, and I could read pretty much pretty well early on, but I never looked at it as my writing language, right? It was never, you know, on the radar at all. So I started writing with the intention of publishing in English fairly late in my life, you know, toward the end of my 20s. I was almost 30 years old. So in the beginning, there was, and when you start writing in a different language, it's a really weird experience. It's almost you kind of carve out a new universe in your head, right? You add something, you know, add a world into your brain that didn't exist before. And so for me in the beginning, these two universes overlapped quite a bit, and that made it pretty challenging. You know, for the first couple of years, you felt sort of trapped in this gray zone between languages. You know, I did a lot of kind of back and forth, a lot of kind of it came with a lot of frustration, those early projects. But as time went on, you know, those two universes, you know, kind of drifted away. And now I feel like they're pretty separate. You know, when I go to English, when I write in English, I, you know, live or you know, reside in a completely different world. And I can kind of move out of it and, you know, almost tiptoe back into my native tongue when I, you know, want to write in Farsi. So now I'm kind of at the point that can sort of manage these two universes fairly effortlessly, right? I can move back and forth between them, but it did take a you know, take a long time and a lot of practice and a lot of reading. You know, maybe thousands of pages in the beginning. I had to throw them away before, you know, I managed to wrest these universes apart in my head.
For me, my Arabic is spoken Arabic rather than, you know, written or literary Arabic. So that's not my written Arabic isn't strong enough for it to influence my prose. But the spoken, very much I let into the dialogue. Quite a lot of kind of untranslated bits of Arabic, and I also did it with French. Tried to do that with French in the book. And that's partly because my character himself has these very different experiences or parts of his life that exist in different languages, and he can't translate himself between the two. So I wanted to include some of the texture of the languages to, I don't know, to communicate that in a sense. Also because I guess when I was imagining the scenes in Palestine, I was imagining them in Arabic, so it felt natural to try and blend them a little bit, I think.
I guess I would agree that there are parts of characters that don't translate across languages, and then there are parts that definitely bleed in across those areas. And you know, there's a good bit of Spanish running through Savage Tongues, and that's the kind of haunted language inside the haunted sort of text and the landscape as well. And I guess it's sort of like I experience them as ghosts when I'm speaking in English, because I experience it as a kind of colonial language. It's always haunted by Farsi, and when I'm speaking in Farsi, especially because my Farsi is also spoken and not literary, I feel very haunted by English, and every limitation that I experience in Farsi feels to me like a colonial defeat or an extension of the colonial defeat. So you know, I think it's back to Isabella's point about when you're writing in English, you're more aware of the trapdoors, you know, that you could write your way into, because you are kind of controlling or manipulating the reader's gaze, and or at least engaging with the reader's gaze. And it is, I am far more aware of the kinds of stereotypes I could write my way into or out of when I'm writing in English, which is the only language I really write in, even though I'm often feeling in Farsi or thinking in Spanish. But I only write in English for now.
Thank you. Yeah, all really interesting comments. Azareen has asked me to pepper a few of my own questions, and so I'm going to do that. And then in between, I'd like for more people to raise their hands. Don't be shy. You can click on reactions and then just raise your hand and contribute to the conversation. So one huge question I actually had that ran through my mind a lot was around the Parisian for Isabella. I just, you know, I teach Arab literature, and I specialize in teaching Palestinian literature. And I was just like really struck by this like epic novel about Palestinian, a kind of history of the Palestinian community in Palestine and abroad before 1948. There aren't that many novels that focus on that period. And I was particularly struck by the sort of commitment to this like intimate social history. And I wondered about what, you know, how you're thinking about, I guess, those questions, and also how you interact with the archive and with social history and with sort of historical text, whether that was I mean, I imagine it must have been like a big part of the process of writing the novel. So I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, when I set out to write it, very much it was kind of an intentionally pre-48 narrative. I wanted to write something that was political in its very nature, rather than, and then not really need to kind of feel like I was sloganeering or anything in the text itself, but by the very fact of it, writing about Palestinians before 1948, I was, you know, in one fell swoop, slapping across the face the idea that it was a land without people for people without a land, which was the key slogan of the Zionist movement. Yeah, so but it was very challenging. And one of the main reasons, I mean, my primary mode of research, I did spend some time in archives, and I read a lot of history books and spent a lot of time with historians and harassed lots of scholars. But my main research method was just talking to elderly people. And I was a little late. Most elderly people who remember clearly the time before 1948 aren't with us any longer. But also it was quite challenging actually to just get past the shadow of the Nakba. Like, it's quite hard to make people talk about the period before. It's actually sort of wiped out. Even my grandmother, very until recently, quite insistent that I had written a novel about the Nakba. So she would say, she was giving me books about the Nakba, and I would say, no, I'm writing before 1948. She said, it's all Nakba. I was like, no, it's not. It's sort of, it's so dominant in the imaginary, And so in a way, I also became an exercise of sort of decolonizing the imagination, to imagine this time before when actually there weren't borders. You could jump on a train and go to Haifa, to Gaza, into Cairo, this sort of, that was the kind of, it's almost science fiction-y, to think about that period before, and all the possibilities and the sort of political possibilities that people were thinking of, whether it was all going to be one united Syria, whether there was also a possibility that it was kind of touted that maybe Palestine would be linked with Egypt. So that was all part of it. I don't know that I intended so much to write about the movement, the independence movement, or kind of struggle itself from the get-go, because I was thinking, oh, I'll just write about Midhat. But the more I read and the more I learned, it was also kind of a learning experience to me to learn about this period, which I didn't know in great depth, and it was, the stories were so rich, and it was irresistible to write about it, really.
Yeah, thank you. It's just wonderful. Really, I'm so excited to teach it. And also, I think it's interesting that you talk about it as science fiction. It just speaks so much to the way that kind of uncovering the past gives us so many different ways of thinking about what could happen in the future, Okay, so I have a few questions. One is, I'm just going to call people up. We have a question from Mariam Ali-Nejad.
Thank you. I am Iranian, and I am a student in Geneva. It's about 2 years I am living here. But based on what Azareen said, I found myself, since I started studying here, that colonial gaze, dominated all my research. I am quite sure it has started before, but little by little, I am getting, more conscious about that. As I am seeing these writers, your guests, lived and grew up outside of the country they are talking about. I am very curious to know how they approach, how they see the country, and how they manage to not see their country as well as that colonial gaze. That they get rid of that gaze. You know what I mean? Because that gaze, it's for me. And as I'm seeing to many Iranians I am in contact with, they are unconsciously affected by that gaze. Am I clear?
Yes, thank you, Mariam. Who would like to take that? I don't think each of you all need to answer the question. One of you can take it if you feel particularly passionate about it, or more than.
Amir, do you?
Yeah, go. I think it was kind of addressed to you partially. Yeah.
Okay. Salam, thank you for your question. And I actually want to answer the question by thinking through Amir's novel. So I'll just do that and blend the two. I think that, we all become, it's almost like living in exile, arriving to continental Europe or the US, you feel the impact of that gaze like a shock wave, even if you feel it unconsciously while you're living in Iran, or at least from my experience. And it's so much of Iranian politics is oriented towards this rejection of the West currently, but also previously this almost like excessive over-identification or glorification. And then the period of the revolution, which Amir's book, I think, like really artfully takes all of the political ideologies that coexisted, whether it was, modern Iranian Islamic political thinkers, or people who suffered under Savak, and then people who suffered under you know, the Revolutionary Guard and solitary confinement and political imprisonment, and the continuities between these political ideologies run through Amir's novel. And I think it sort of, for me, when I was reading it, like seeing the buses, the strike that the bus drivers go on, and the ways in which there's a gridlock in the city where nobody can move from one end to the other, was kind of like a physical or material allegory for the gridlock in the conversation that takes place between the narrator and the state, you know, the interrogator. And it's sort of like we're going in circles, and we're so, you know, trapped, because in a sense how could we have not have internalized the colonial gaze? It's impossible, because this is the kind of like body-centered violence of imperialism. The violence is so extreme, it's so complete, that there is no way in which we cannot be in conversation with it constantly, because that would be a denial of history entirely. And then the ways in which that gaze becomes both more apparent or clear or complicated when we live in exile, it's like another layer of madness that gets layered on top of all the other kind of discourses that we have to navigate every day. And, you know, what we're answerable to, even in terms of like the Western gaze and its kind of conceptions of colorism in the Middle East, or their conceptions of race and ethnicity in the Middle East, and not understanding how diverse it is, or how multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious it is. So it's like, I think about the interrogation in your book, Amir, as like, that is the interrogation we all are living in all the time. It's just that our interrogator shifts depending on where we're living, but yeah, unfortunately that's the state. That's the state of things. And I just don't think we can beat around the bush about it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, literally, when I was interrogated in Iran once, and once at JFK, it was like during the travel ban. I had, committed the sin of traveling on an Iranian passport. The similarities were shocking. I mean, the type of questions I was being asked in the airport, like the rhythm of, the questioning, the tone of the interrogator, the way they cross question you to make you contradict yourself. All of the tactics that I, experienced in Iran during that session very similarly were executed at JFK too. So it's not even like metaphoric. It can be very kind of literally replicated here as well. Yeah, this is it kind of takes me actually to another point. Now I can kind of tie it to Bella's novel, The Parisian. It is it is like a, I don't know, universally acknowledged truth that Americans don't know much about people from elsewhere, right? And it's pretty accurate. I mean, if you live here for a little while, you know that. I'm not going to be kind of snob about it. I don't know much about like 90% of the world either. But I think it becomes particularly problematic when those countries are in the headlines all the time. And I think Iran and Palestine, actually the countries that we talk about here, are kind of prime examples of that. So you feel, this daily experience, almost, humiliation of seeing the name of a country, your country, in the headlines, and then you read the news or you listen to the pundits, and what they say has nothing to do with like the reality of that country, with what happens on the ground in that place. So you live this kind of disparity, this mismatch, right, between what's considered as reality in the news, and and it's like a relentless kind of talking about it all the time in this particular cases of Iran and Palestine. So you feel this mismatch. It almost you see your country kind of being disemboweled on a daily basis in the news, right? The content of it, like the materiality of it, is being sort of taken out of it, and the husk of it is being discussed 24/7, and on all of these news channels. So then when you kind of sit down to write about it, I felt this urge, almost like a cartographic urge, right, to put like the actual country back on the map, right, to kind of move away from that husk that, you know, I hear about all the time in the news, and just, you know, add like almost shovel details, right, you know, smells, I don't know, the surfaces that you touch, like different kind of aspects of daily conversation, how people interact with each other, the clothes, all of that. So you feel like a pressure almost, you know, cartographic pressure to recreate a place with words and, you know, with and kind of fill it up with details, as much details as possible, to bring that physicality back to that word, right, that is being kind of constantly consumed in English. And I was actually, when I was thinking about Bella's novel, I saw that urge there too, right? Like a, you know, the recreation of a place with all its details, all these kind of sensations, you know, the way like a body experiences a place, right? I you know, thought that you, I don't know, consciously or not, but it's there in the book, or maybe I'm reading into it.
No, that's definitely, I definitely agree with that. I think that I was obsessive about details, and particularly the details of the senses. So in some ways you know, I feel like I wrote, well, I had two ways to answer. Well, first of all, I'll say that when I was speaking to elderly people, predominantly my relatives really, the kind of key mnemonics were to ask about sort of sensory details as much as I could. Fortunately, my grandmother has an amazing memory for details. She's, I think, half inventing, but still they're wonderful inventions. And she can really remember the colors of things, the smells of things, what she ate on a particular day. And that was very important for me on a personal level, as a sort of imaginative act of trying to recreate pre-Nakba Palestine for myself. But it also did feel like it had this political valency, as you say, Amir, in terms of providing a counterpoint, or provocative counterpoint, to both you know, the twin terrors, I suppose, of simplify or headlines which don't show detail, or which present things in one particular way repeatedly, and the kind of meta-narratives of history as well, you know, the history is written by the victors, and those two go together, I think, when, you know, in the business of these countries, and the suffering involved is not finished. So they go together very much, history being written. And I think that that's a little bit the way in which I defend to myself the use of a certain kind of literary realism that I undertook when writing this novel, which is very much focused on scene making and on those very particular details of the present moment, and creating the experiences of being in rooms. And I think that there's one part of me that wonders why I wrote something that is classical in this manner. There's a little voice that thinks, you know, the sort of Barbara Harlow idea that such a traditional narrative form is inherently conservative, inherently has conservative politics. I actually don't believe that. I think that the form is detachable from politics, and there are lots of examples to go into. But I think that part of the reason that particular kind of realism appealed to me, half of it's unconscious, but part of it is this thing of to make it as real as possible in the actual scene. The scene making is so important, and it is about providing this counterpoint, this experienced but embodied counterpoint to the other ways that one experiences Palestine from afar. I don't know if that was clear. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to pepper one more question in. I wanted to ask Azareen a question, which is one of the sort of deepest and most striking things to me about the book has to do with the way that you handle the question of sexual violence, and the way that sexual violence becomes like some kind of like underground system through which you can bore deeper in and look at other histories of violence, of familial, colonial, imperial violence, and that there's this kind of like very deep interconnection. And I think that the space where they all meet is the body. But I was hoping you could talk about the journey you took with that, with those intersections, and how you came to write about those intersections and those making those connections. Yeah, in the process of working on the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm looking at the clock, so I'll try to be concise. I think it's continuous with this question Isabella and Amir were answering about history being in the headlines in very particularly reductive ways, and then the meta-narratives of history that we've all inherited, and how those histories are traditionally written from the perspective of the male gaze as well. And the Savage Tongues is a really like female-centered novel. You know, it really looks at questions of history and sociality and embodiment from the perspective of these two women who are actually on the surface supposedly situated to be antagonistic characters. You know, one is Iranian and one is Israeli American. But they're actually living in this incredibly deep kind of almost spiritual friendship where they're examining questions of disorientation, political disorientation, and violences that the violences that keep getting passed on from hand to hand, the violence of the Holocaust, and then the violence of the Nakba, the violence of colonialism in Iran. And meeting in Andalusia, which is like this Muslim and Sephardic and Christian space, and looking at the question of sexual violence, you know, it's sort of like the female, there is no way for me to think about questions of history from the female gaze without exploring questions of sexual violence, the sort of statistics about sexual violence in war zones, in, you know, areas where there is a lot of violence happening and there's deep precarity in networks of sort of like refugee networks of exiting countries in order to be rehomed elsewhere. There's so much sexual violence that takes place. And sexual violence is such a deep kind of, it's literally violence that enters, like it breaks through the surface of your body and is deposited into you and forever changes the female body, the female consciousness. So, you know, it's sort of like, I can't think about the politics of colonialism without thinking about how desire, both healthy, like, you know, desire and violent desire play a hand in all of that, in how the bodies get trafficked or understood or misplaced. So it's kind of a really deep, intimate question that I'm still trying to, you know, I think I'll be thinking about this for a long time past this novel. So hopefully the answer will keep unraveling over time.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few more questions. I did say that we would maybe spill over for another 10 minutes. Are you guys up for that, or do you want to wrap up? Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right, I have quite a long question here that I'm just going to read out. Or maybe I'll allow the person to just get on and say it. It's Austin Wallers. Do you want to come on?
Yeah, I'll try to read it more or less verbatim so I don't wander around too much, but it's for Amir.
Thank you.
One facet of your book I was really struck by was how seamlessly technology was incorporated into it. So you have the descriptions of the text messages, the video, and the audio transcripts from Eunice's study group, which were all very visceral to me. Especially like the description of the photo where the plant in the study group seems to be kind of gesturing towards the photographer. And then with the video, you have sort of construction of a false narrative going on that is used to eventually indict Eunice, which, you know, we could link with how technology is interacting with politics now all day long. Again, at the end, you have the protesters finding out things through Facebook, and the photographers, or the photographs the young protesters try to post online, etc. And I was just curious of, while you were writing at these sort of issues of 21st century technology and like increasing technological surveillance were on your mind. I'm especially maybe interested in this from a temporal angle, since your book kind of takes place like just as this is starting to become an issue. And of course, now it's like a huge issue. And yeah, if you could just speak to that a little.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Yeah, surveillance definitely was, on my mind. I was writing this book. Obviously, it's a book about prison, but I had it's another universally acknowledged truth that Facebook sucks, but that was not that commonly accepted back then. 2010 definitely, if you remember the Arab Spring, how they kind of stepped forward and took credit for the whole thing. And so when I was kind of researching this novel, like mid 2015, I started writing 2016. We were still in this kind of transition period. People were, coming to realize that the social media companies are actually evil. They're not like pro-democracy, or they're not like helping any, like popular uprising. They haven't helped any good cause ever, right? In their history, in their short history. But back then, it was not, as I said, that like widely accepted. So I was determined to kind of include that somehow in this book. This is not the book, obviously, directly about social media. But as you pointed out, I tried to bring in like as many kind of facts and allusions as possible. And this was informed by what I saw in Iran, 2009 Green Movement, especially. And it was at the time, as I said, that the social media companies, which were, in their like very early stages back then, they were just running around taking credit for, all of these movements all over the world. And I was witnessing in Iran that everybody, the state arrests is through Facebook or through, breaking into their email accounts. Everyone they took to prison, one of the first things that they just put in front of them was their Facebook chats, even their emails, right? They already had access to their emails. And, it could be anything. I mean, you had like a kind of innocent chat with your cousin who was an activist in the US, right? And it doesn't have like a political content necessarily, but they use that, they held that up against you. They use it to kind of accuse you of all of this kind of stupid, grandiose crimes. So yeah, this from that experience, I was kind of watching it firsthand that, yeah, they are the tools of the state, and they're like tools of oppression, and that the state is effectively using them to oppress like a popular uprising. But around the world in the news, they are kind of being sort of presented as this sort of pro-democracy, amazing technologies that we all have to embrace. So yeah, it's definitely there.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm actually, I have one more question here that I'm going to piggyback on because it fits really well into the thematics of the series. And it's Sarah Judy asks, I'd love to hear each of you discuss the way you consider the relationship between the novel and history. What is the role of the novel in excavating history? And I wanted to kind of piggyback on that question in order to ask a kind of broader question, which is kind of what is the relationship between literature and historical preservation, and also what is it that literature can do that like history can't do? What aspects of history and sociality and experience which are being erased and violated can literature capture or engage with that history actually isn't able to? And I guess I would ask if you could, if it's possible, if you have an answer to this, whether or not that's something that informs your writing.
I can start. Well, I think the novel as a form and the ability that it affords the author to enter into consciousnesses speculatively is what history cannot do, is to look at the look at the what exists in the gaps between action and action. I think that is what it gives us. You know, I think that in order to kind of peer into the gaps in what can be recorded in an archive, that's what literature can give us, to look at things that don't make the cut in terms of history. And that might be because they're events that happen to people, whether because of their gender, their nationality, the color of their skin, they don't have the privilege of being recorded in the archive in the same way, and that we can access that through novelizing, or if it's simply that they weren't the victors of history. I think that that's kind of an area that the novel can access, but also the things that are incidental. You know, the thing of micro history, of looking at what is small, what doesn't amount to anything, what actually runs counter to perhaps the grand meta narrative. Those aspects I think we can also access through novelizing.
Azareen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think Isabella just articulated it so beautifully. Yeah, I think it's sort of like micro, macro, and, you know, it's not necessarily the task of literature to archive history, but, you know, I think that it is a very special art form in the sense that it's such an open container, and it can hold so many different facets and so many layered realities that would appear as though they were in contradiction with one another. I think the novel is particularly good at holding all of those things. And I think it's also voices that have either been silenced or dismissed historically. There's an opportunity through the novel to kind of breathe life back into those bodies and to kind of give, you know, it's sort of like language is an extension of consciousness. It's how we externalize consciousness, and it's, I think it's like a great gesture of both recovery and resistance, and also, I don't want to say optimism, but maybe piss optimism, as like Emil Habibi would put it. So yeah, I feel like to me, it's one of the most exciting art forms to inhabit, really, because the possibilities are so infinite. Yeah.
Yeah, I like what Doctorow said in answering that question. You know, I was asked about the difference between a historian and a novelist, and he said that a historian tells you what happened, the novelist tells you what it felt like. I think it's pretty good, you know, distinction. I think what novels can do that history cannot is the novel tells you how history kind of takes place on a body, on a specific body, right? A historian never tells you that. You know, in history, you read that this or that happened, or this person did that, or, you know, this person went there, they did this negotiation and so on. But you never know what, you know, what went through the mind of that person in that particular moment, or what happened, you know, what kind of sensations, you know, bodily sensations maybe even that person had in that particular moment. And the novel has this kind of amazing capacity to articulate that, right? To speculate about it and to kind of put it to words. So I look at the novel as kind of the contact point of the history and the body, you know, and history maybe is more like a disembodied version of the past. The novel is kind of intensely embodied, is intensely corporeal.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that occurs to me about your book in terms of this question is the way in which your novel has so many different registers of the political in it. When I think about history, or sort of historical, political, or journalistic language, there's always this kind of like mono register of the political, you know, like sort of like one narrative. And you have these kind of languages of politics that are like, you know, the protest, social media, the torturer, the language of the jail cell, the language of the body, the language of kind of like Iranian and Arab political thinkers, and of Marx, and all of that is inside this container of one book. And I really loved that, and it kind of brought home to me this idea of the novel as this kind of archive of political languages that just kind of push up against each other often without actually meeting each other, but kind of coexisting in the same space.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's actually, just to be very brief, I think we're out of time. I read a book like a few years ago, Myth and Archive, and it's about like archive and the history of the novel in Latin America. And I came across a very interesting fact that the idea of archive in Spain becomes popular around the same time as Don Quixote is published. All right, so these two events are simultaneous. And so Cervantes, as this scholar shows, for as a novel, because that literary form didn't exist before him, or at least not in that sense of the word. One of the intentions that he had, one of the projects that he had in mind, was to write a book in which he could preserve all forms of language, all ways of kind of speaking that people did at his time. He can preserve them as a narrative. We can kind of process all of these linguistic forms into one book, right, and preserve them in one place. So these two, the rise of the novel and the rise of the archive are actually kind of simultaneous, and they're very closely connected.
Thanks, that's really beautiful, and a great note to end on. So thank you everyone so much for your readings and for this really stimulating conversation. Thanks everyone for being here, and we really look forward to welcoming you again to the reading with Elias Khoury and Susan Abul Hawa on February 19th. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.